Hello, I'm Gary Quinn, and welcome to another episode of Ready, Set, Live. My guest in studio today is producer, writer, director, actor, and author, Sebastian Siegel. Welcome to the show, Sebastian. It's always great to see you.
It's great to be here. It's great to be in a real studio with real people.
I know, How have you been dealing with, I don't want to say isolation, but just a sense of this pandemic where we're not able to connect with people because you're used to being around so many people. Did it affect you? I mean, everybody's had their own kind of, or they've had breakthroughs or they've had breakdowns. Have you had a breakthrough?
Certainly a bit of both. I think in the one way that if I think back, that life is really about communication. And I don't mean in even a philosophical or psychological sense, but just woven into the fabric of the cosmos. If we even go back 14 billion years to the Big Bang, it's really about quarks and atoms and neurons and electrons and protons, and their only motive, their only purpose, their only instinctive drive is to connect. That somehow these tiny particles are finding one another across the universe and proliferating. And then from that eventually comes life, and here we are. So to stop that process, to block out that process with separation is intrinsically against everything that we intuit, I think, in existence. So for sure, that's affected me on a base, fundamental molecular level, that and when I say it's affected me, I mean when I see other people who are afraid to connect. Our nature is to reach out and touch. The baby when it is born wants to grab the finger and connect. We want to hug each other. And I think that at some juncture, what's worth the price of admission? That's what we've come for, that the story of humanity, the story of life as we know it, the story of sentience is the story of freedom, and in that freedom comes the liberation to commune, to connect. So in that way, I think just sort of existentially, it's a challenge for me to acknowledge. Now, nevertheless, I am collaborative, and I want to be solution-oriented, with the rest of the world, and in part with the rest of the world. But I also don't want to disregard that deep, deep, deep power that is called on within us to connect, and so it's a sort of a melancholic way forward, I suppose, in some way. The hope, though, however, without choice, is the need to then in some way go in and re-identify what's the most important thing to us. And then also have perhaps to appreciate with further degree simple sentient connection. For me, when we spoke and you invited me to come down, I thought this is spectacular to come down and connect with real humans who care. People. Yeah, is like really, really powerful. So we can do this on Zoom. We can do this. I said, yes, 100%. And so I suppose in that way, reflectively. To look back through history and societies that succeeded or failed, to think, wow, this is such a blessing to be right here, right now in this life. Just the simple feeling of being able to hold eye contact in person, with another sentient being who cares is such a wonder. So I suppose on the upside, it is for me a re-examination and a restocking of appreciation, for the subtlety and the simplicity of being sentient.
How did your
being sentient,
sort of your awareness, or were you always? I know your father introduced you to some very spiritual people at a young age, but what was the catalyst that really kicked it off for you? Was there a moment or a person or something that happened?
That's a great question. I think cognitively, he was a professor of comparative religions, and I went to a Catholic school, but my father's Jewish, but his specialty was in India, and so was teaching Hinduism, and then from there Buddhism and Taoism was his sort of specialty, and Zen, and he always had these items from India, this iconography, the different Indian gods, Ganesha and Hindu and Vishnu and Rama, and I think reading those comics for me, at that time, I didn't have a sense of it. But then now I think retrospectively that just the power of those images as a boy looking at these gods that had many heads and many arms and that were ultimately avatars of one another, perhaps instilled in me a subtle intuition that we are all woven together, that we are all essentially avatars of one another, and I think that kind of just subtle drop in, that subtle channeling of that knowledge probably starts to manifest within me later in life than in writing or as a filmmaker, or in theater. In other words, I think that spiritual, right, or even religious practice becomes manifest, and I become aware of it years later that was ultimately influenced from that iconography that was very much Indian or Hindu. That I start to recognize it, I think later.
Now, you were living in Hawaii, right?
Yeah.
And then you came here.
Yes.
And then some people don't know that you were quite the fashion, let's say, health cover poster man on over 100 magazines. I mean, what was that like? I mean, because you're from a spiritual background, and then all of a sudden you go, oh, my ego could really take over. How do you pull it back in life? Because many people who have such kind of fame, or they have such recognition, they lose it.
Such an important exploration. Yeah, thank you for that. I was in England. I was born in England, British, and then we were in Hawaii, and then I moved to California. And then I was just in the right place at the right time, where I loved physical exercise. But I didn't love it so much to build the muscles or something like this, or to be in a certain shape. Egoically, I think as a boy, there's certainly that egoic sense, and that ego is not bad. That's the vehicle for the soul in this world, right? And so just the sense that I could transform my body through doing push-ups and sprinting and running and etc., hiking, that as a 12, 13, 14-year-old boy, I thought, wow, that's amazing. I have a say in the world. I can transform myself. And then later, I can transform my thoughts. I can transform my mind, my emotions. I can choose the people I spend time around. I can choose how I show up in the world. I think that's where I fell in love with that. And then as a test, really to see what's the limit that I can push then physically? How far can I push myself? How far can I use physicality to push myself emotionally? How far can I push myself with discipline? So then I think when I came to Los Angeles, and I felt very fortunate. The first magazine cover I did was for Men's Fitness. And then I did over 200 magazine covers after that. Ironman, Muscle Fitness, Men's Fitness, etc. Muscle Media. All these, muscle. So magazines that don't exist anymore, right? And I was just in the right place at the right time. But I must say that at that time I had already fallen in love with reading. I wasn't a reader as a kid. But I had fallen in love with Joseph Campbell, who I'd met when I was a boy. I'd fallen in love with Alan Watts. I'd fallen in love with Ken Wilber. I'd fallen in love with Ramana Maharshi, etc., Schopenhauer. And so I think that when I was on the covers, it was fortunate for me because I didn't get lost in it egoically. And I'm very outgoing, but I'm very reclusive. And so I think that I was fortunate to have the ingredients of loving connecting with people, but also not identifying with this sense of physicality so much so in the world. Understanding that, hey, this is a powerful vehicle to forward my voice in the world, but I have a body, but I'm not my body. In other words, that's not who I am. And so I remember when I would go to the magazine rack, to read the magazines that I loved reading, and I would pick up Muscle and Fitness to read about what am I going to do and what's, read about physiology and kinesiology and nutrition. And I would see myself, and I'd be on the cover of 4 magazines. I'd be on Ironman and Muscle Media and Men's Fitness and Physical. And I would say, wow, it was too much for me. I said, I don't want to look at that because I don't want to get lost in that. Right. But I was humbled and appreciative of it enormously. It helped me buy my first home. And so I think, with that, just the sense of saying, well, if we show up in this world and we are able to have some sort of success that relates to our physical well-being, that's a beautiful thing, right? That is a spiritual aspect of our own manifestation that takes on whatever form it takes on. And I feel fortunate, very deeply grateful for being able to harness some sort of physicality that's been enjoyable, for me, and that it's been a vehicle also for me in other ways.
And you also were able to now adapt the book from Ken Wilber, which is Grace and Grit, and you actually, beginning, middle, and end, brought it to fruition now where it's coming out. Talk to me about how that sort of happened, or was it always in the back of your mind, I'm going to get this book and I'm going to make it happen? What was the catalyst?
How long was the show?
Give me the condensed version.
Okay, I'll give you the Reader's Digest. Right. The abridged is essentially I had this mad love affair with Alan Watts. Right. I'd read everything he's ever written and listened to everything he'd ever done. And then I was reading other philosophers and psychologists, depth psychology and Jung, obviously, and Schopenhauer, etc. And then through a multitude of different avenues, Ken Wilber just started showing up in my life. Someone would say, "You've got to read this," or "My father loved this and it reminds me of you. You've got to read this." And it was just eventually, and then someone gave me one of his books, and so it was like coming from all these different angles. Yeah, and I was a voracious reader at the time, and that book, A Brief History of Everything, was down on in my living room, in my car, and I had different books, and it was down on the list. And so then eventually I said, all right, I got to go home tonight and pull that back up to the top. This is really showing up in my world. So I read that book, and then I read it again. And the second time I read it slowly, and I just took literally a long time, 2-3 months. And I said, if I'm going to process this, I don't want to just have it here up in the head. I want to really own it inside. And it transformed me in such a way that he was saying things and writing things and articulating things in ways that were spectacular. Yeah. And we've all read many authors that have that effect on us, that speak to us. But Ken's work is so comprehensive, yeah, that he's read everything, and he wrote a book a year, for over 20 years, essentially. And the brilliance and the sharpness, and yet also the wicked humor, spoke to me in such a way that I felt, wow, I'm apprehending now the world in a new spectacular way. From there, I went on to read most of his other books, all on consciousness. And then Grace and Grit, which is a true story, which is this epic love story that he wrote, that he adapted from his wife's journals, I read later in his writing. And then when I first read it, I bawled my eyes out. And I was working on a film as an actor in Atlanta when I finished it. And I just laid on the bed and I cried. And I was like, wow, this is devastating. And yet the story is full of hope. And I thought to myself when I put it down, I thought this would make the most amazing film, because I've never read a book like Grace and Grit before, right? I've never read a love story so true and so powerful that gives me such a sense of what eternal life is, of what that connection is that lasts beyond us, right? And we all hope for eternal love in some way. And this really demonstrated that. So I never thought of it as that I would be participating in it as a film in any way. It was sort of, wow, what an amazing thing to be a part of. And then subsequently, years later, I had not met Ken yet. We met and we became simpatico and were connected. And then other producers, many had come before me to make that book into a film. But it's not just a love story. It's in the way of The Tree of Life, Malik's film, or even The Fountain, Aronofsky's film, with Hugh Jackman. It's really a story about eternal life and love. And that, I think, is integral to its success as a story in the media of film. So then subsequently, Ken gave me an interview. We met, we connected, and then he gave me an interview in my first documentary film, Awakening World, that I wrote, produced, and directed. What's the purpose of life? What's love? What's heaven? What's hell? What's intimacy? Are the questions in that film. And then after that, I said, hey, what's happening with Grace and Grit? Is that going to become a film? Because if not, I would love to participate. I would love to contribute in any way, whether it's as a writer, as an actor, as a producer, as a director, in any way to bring that, because I think that the world is ripe for this story. And it was the right place and right time. And I then acquired the rights and then adapted the screenplay. And then, I sold my soul. And, and then I meticulously sort of went through it. And I think that I was called really to tell that story, that I didn't choose it as much as it chose me. And from the beginning, I wasn't holding it, like saying this is my story, because it's not. I'm just in service to it. Yeah. And so, and then so many synchronistic things occurred along the way. Every actor involved, every different individual involved to bring that story to fruition. And
that will come out June 4th. In the theaters and on live stream.
Yes. So on or about June 4th. Okay. And it'll be in theaters East Coast and West Coast, depending on the situation, with how theaters are. But we will premiere at the Mann's Chinese Theater, the most famous theater in the world, where most people have been to, where the handprints are in the front. We pre-screened there. And then it will stream everywhere movies are streamed. Yeah.
Excellent. Do you find that you feel more comfortable as a director, writer, or actor? What's the feeling? Or is it all I feel good, all of them?
They all feel so great. Okay. And I think contingent upon the individuals that we're engaged and interacting with and partnering with and collaborating with. I think that it's like if we had four kids,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and I said, which kid do you love the best? He'd say, well, I fish with my daughter,
Right.
and I play chess with my son, and I sit in the park with my other daughter, and I love to talk and read with my other boy. I think that those things each bring out a different terrain within myself.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly working as an actor, I've been very fortunate as an actor. I'm shooting a movie this month in Hawaii. To get lost in just taking on a character, such a fun thing to do. It's the luckiest job, one of the luckiest jobs in the world to have. Producing requires a certain type of communication and collaboration beyond any other job I've known before. It requires working with individuals that are wonderful, but also enormous challenges. It's a job that requires apprehending challenges and fixing them and solving them every single day, and I like that puzzle. And then writing is a work of solitude, and I enjoy that as well. In the time of the 24 months or something that I wrote, adapted Grace and Grit from the book. It was a deeply transformative and cathartic experience for me to cry and to write and to share and to inhabit every single character in that screenplay. But directing calls upon, for me, something that demands complete collaboration and faith, right? That as a director, director has to have a specialty in every department, right? Whether it's acting and lenses and location and producing and wardrobe and sound and light and makeup and everything, and yet must be able to achieve a story in the most beautiful way, to be able to trust and collaborate with those departments completely. In other words, I have a complete understanding of every department, yet I am not as skilled as the best people in that department. And so I must trust and collaborate with them to bring each element of the story to the greatest possible heights that it can. So I love directing in a certain kind of way. I suppose that might be my favorite child, right? But I'm so grateful for all of them. They're all demanding and fun.
What's your definition, Sebastian, of trust? What would that encompass for people or for yourself?
Trust is an interesting one, and I think that there's a lot of semantic confusion between trust and hope and faith. Yeah, hope is tied to a future. I hope that X and X will happen. I hope that you will show up. I hope that I will show up. I hope that you won't lie to me, that you won't cheat on me, that I won't cheat on myself. Right? But it's a beautiful thing. We have to have hopes to go forward. Trust is saying, it's one step beyond faith. I mean, it's one step beyond hope. Trust is saying, I trust you. You may betray me, you may not, but I trust that you're not going to. I trust that I'm going to show up, that I'm going to have the courage and the strength to be there when the moment calls. I trust that when I get in the water, I hope I can swim. Now I say I can do it, and I'm going to get in the pool. Hope is I want to get in that water. Trust is saying I'm going to get in the water, and I trust that I'm not going to sink. Faith is spectacular, though. Faith is the moment that we say, I may sink and I may drown, or I may swim. We may get there, and you may cheat on me, you may deceive me, you may rip my heart out. I may not have the courage to stand when I get there and be strong enough for me or for you, but I'm going anyways. That's faith. And for me, that is I think for anyone, who comes through the other side of any challenge, it demands faith. The Red Sea doesn't split until Moses puts his foot out first, and then it splits.
And I think so many people, not just in America, but around the world, the globe, they don't trust themselves, or they don't know how to be authentic. So they try to fit a mold of this is how I should be, this is how I should look, but then you don't get the real authentic person. And I think that's what's missing in the world today. And I believe through growth, you spiritually align to your creative passion, but you also become authentic in yourself. What would you say or recommend to somebody who's going through, well, I meditate, I maybe read a couple spiritual books and I'm okay, but they're really not changing. What would you say? Here's a couple tips you can do that would maybe authenticate you to become the real you.
It's great. There's the long way and the short way. To truncate the long way, I would say there's a method and there's tools. And, getting lost in psychology can be can be wonderful because there's so many tools in psychology. But it can also be a labyrinth that we can't get out of, right? Because ultimately we don't just live from here. We live from here. And we have to not put ourselves in these puzzles where we think, it all ends up here. It's like religion and science. Science is the greatest possible way to know what to do next to create and overcome. And yet religion is the greatest possible way to create meaning. And those two belong together. And when we fall just in religion and faith or just in science, we're having a challenge. So I think in the same way, just in meditation or spiritual or dogmatic practice or just in psychology, either one can be a challenge. In other words, somebody sits down to meditate, they have a spiritual practice, but they might still be becoming more of an asshole. They might still be becoming more egoic, more self-centered and thinking, I'm having this satori state, this high experience, feeling one with the universe and my dog and the rainbow. And yet I'm, still a crude, selfish person. That's possible. And that happens all the time. What I like to call new age spirituality, right? And I think what you're saying is so powerful because a lot of that is happening. Now, the beautiful part is a lot of people are dropping into wanting to find self-discovery. So I think that in that it's to say, let's choose multiple paths. I'm going to meditate, but I'm also going to work on culturally with other people. I'm also going to work on how can I contribute, etc. I'm also going to work on my own, physical health, because the more healthy I am, the more joyous I am, the more I show up better for myself and for others. That's the long way. The short way, I would say, is the sort of Zen way, which is to say, this life is gone in an instant. I'm going to die in 1 second. Like I have 1 instant left. The sun is setting now. Right? What is it that really fills me with life? It's looking in the eyes of my dog or the eyes of another person and feeling that joy. Today I'm going to go out, and even if it crucifies me, even if it brings me to tears, or if it brings me to elation, I'm going to connect. I'm going to give everything I have to everything I do. That's the short way.
And I think when people look at our situation, sometimes they take it for granted, and life is so quick. You blink and 20 years goes by. And I think we all need to take advantage of saying, this is the moment we have. We might not have another one. And we can't take any moment for granted because that is all there is. And love is all there is. Because when you leave this experience, you're going to take away, you're not going to take your watch. You're not going to take your house. You're not going to take your bank account. You're going to take away the experience that I'm sitting here with a friend and Sebastian and we're talking about life, or I had a coffee with that person. And I think people have taken that for granted because, I know when I meet spiritual people that leave the planet, I'm like, wow. I remember when I used to have lunch quite often or go to her house, Debbie Ford, I saw her November and in February she was gone. So I think we have to take stock in saying, you know what, this moment is all we have. If you had 8 months left in this experience, and I use this in sometimes when I speak, what would you do, Sebastian, or what would you say to someone that you need to say?
This is okay. First, I want to come back to the thing where you're saying about you can't take it with you.
Correct.
And I remember as a boy looking at the Pharaoh and these civilizations in Egypt and how they would bury their whole.
Right.
They would kill thousands of people and bury them with them to say, I'm going to take my chariot and my family and the whole thing. I'm thinking, well, why not just build something new when you get there? It might not work, right, when you get there. And that I appreciate and respect what you're saying about that appreciation, because it's not a intellectual recognition, it's a practice. And I love the way you stated that. It is every day saying, that's the power of practice, because we have to do it every day. It's like breathing. We don't just breathe and now I've got enough oxygen for life.
Right.
We've got to always say, I'm going to be appreciative today. I'm going to remind myself. I work on that all the time. It's super important. Zen has been an influence on me, perhaps. Would I wind up my watch for 8 minutes left or 8 months left? I wouldn't. If I had 8 minutes left, I would stay right here and I would stay on the show. This is it, right? I think that the danger, I think, in this life, and the danger of being so conscious and being so intelligent as humans as we are, is to think that we can create heaven in some other place, in that future moment. That's the moment we start to steal from God, that we start to steal from life. I'm going to create it tomorrow. It's right here, right? Everyone understands be here now, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But it's a dangerous one because it's so everywhere. It's so fundamental. If we feel that we would wind up our watch, then we're missing something.
Correct.
It's dangerous, right? I'm happy right here,
Well,
now. If the quake happens while we're in this building, it shakes. I'm not going anywhere.
Correct. But people are looking into the future or the past, and I think being in the now, whether it's a moment of yourself having a cup of tea, or you're with a friend, or you're having a great meal, that is the essence of what there is, and that is all there is. And I think people during this time, this pandemic situation, they've had to look at themselves, and some of them I don't think are so happy of what they see in the mirror. And I feel that happiness it's an evolution of what's happening right now. What would be your definition of happiness?
The simple feeling of being. And I love what you said about appreciation, because I think that the fastest, beeline to ultimate spirit, or, to Godhead, is appreciation, right? Wow, this puppy's beautiful, the sky, or the storm, or just, I had a tough time. Yesterday I fell. I twisted my ankle a little bit, and I was upset at myself. I was disappointed in myself.
You did?
I did. Yeah, I did. I did. Going to see Noreen, going to see my grandmother.
Okay.
And sometimes I went, but how am I going to use that to take greater appreciation for walking?
Awareness.
Right? Yeah, awareness. Happiness is that. I think it's it's interesting because we have an injury, and we deal with the injury, and it's a challenge. But we watch a dog lose its legs, and they put the dog on wheels, or it loses its eye. We've all seen that, and we all love that dog. And why do we love that dog so much? The other dogs don't care more or less for that dog, and that dog has no idea. The dog just it's taking me longer to get from A to B, but he has no concept that he's on wheels. No psychosis, in other words, about it, right?
Right.
And we do, because we have the power to think. And that power to think is our enemy there, because we say, well, what about in the future if I can't get out of bed, if I can't do this and that? It causes all these problems. So happiness is, in one way, having the ability to be afraid, but making the choice to be appreciative instead, right? And in A Course in Miracles, it's that the greatest miracle is that move from fear to love, right?
Correct.
In that certain way. So I think happiness is perhaps not just in the doing of it, but in the very, very uniquely human quality, the awareness that we're making the choice to do it is a really nice awareness to say, imagine, right, to stand on the precipice and say, this may kill me, but I'm going anyways. There's a freedom about that, that we have the freedom to go as we want also. It's really, really nice,
And in your book, and by the way, Sebastian has a book in Switzerland and Germany, and it is called The Consciousness Revolution, Meditations for the New World. I know it's not, is it in English yet or not yet?
It's not.
Soon. All right, well, let's put that intention out. Yeah. It's in English soon. But if you speak German, Swiss German or English.
Oscar Wilde said life is too short to learn German.
Right.
So I don't,
But basically, I know this took a while to write. It wasn't something you did overnight. Even though it doesn't matter where a book comes out, I think just the mindset of empowering people to get to know who you are in those countries is important. What would you say is the thumbnail about this book? What it really says for people?
Thank you. It'll be out next year in English.
Yes.
And I wrote it in English, and then we translated. It's really a story of each chapter, in short, is one part short story, one part psychology, and one part poetic philosophy. And it's an experiential book, I think, to try to take the reader on a ride in a chapter, have fun with it in a very Alan Watts-esque kind of way, just to perhaps suggest or point at things about this world, about existence. In one way, I'm discussing concepts that are all consciousness concepts, but then I'll ground that in each chapter with a short story about my own life, about growing up with my father, or one, a story, a myth about India or something like that, so that each story has something for everyone in there in that chapter, and each chapter has something for everyone. It's a story about Zen. It's a story about, when I say that, it's a story about awakening, I think. It's the book that I wanted to read. I wrote the book that I wanted, and I also love language, and I wanted to flex the language as hard as I could. I wanted to push language to a point that it can't go to. That's what I like to do. I think even with Grace and Grit, with the movie, I want to use that media to the greatest possible edges of its, capacity to touch feelings and hearts and souls. When I think about psychology is the study of the soul, right? It's not the study of the brain. It's not the study of the mind. It's the study of the soul. And so in that way, this book is really an adventure of psychology. It's an adventure of the soul. And I want to perhaps, do that thumb trick, where you fool people a little bit and you bring them in. Hey, look, beer and free chips here.
Correct.
And then you come in and it's like, holy shit, there's no beer and free chips here.
Right.
To woo people into something that is seductive about their own self, right? I like to, when I go into a movie or go into a book, not know what I'm getting into totally, and then go, whoa, that's good. Cry a little bit, laugh a little bit, see something, see one more spectrum in the rainbow. That's the book.
Who inspires you musically?
Oh, wow, that's a great one. Wow, Beethoven, obviously. Yeah. And I mean, the individuals too, Marvin Gaye also, not just the music, but the individuals. And I think let's just take those two guys for a second. The idea that something is channeling through these guys that they can't quite even, they don't even know themselves how grand and big it is, right? And I think like with Marvin Gaye, we grow up and we hear those songs, we hear those songs and the beat is so good and his voice is so tender and we listen to it. And then we become an adult and we have heartache. And then we hear the song and it's a whole new song, right? Then it crucifies us. Yeah, then it takes on this new meaning. And, we can hear those songs so many times. In other words, that the songs, wherever we are in life, greet us differently. Yeah. And I think with, a lot of great classical composers, Brahms, Beethoven, Bach, that you hear that bum 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 bum, right, and that heaviness, and then with the lightness, and then that sort of juxtaposes whatever it is that we're going through. I think musically, when something speaks to us in a way that articulates something that we can't quite put into words, which dovetails back to, I think, myself as a director, as a storyteller, as a writer. I want to push the language to a point that it can't reach, because language is a utility. It happens chronologically. It gets us warm and it gets us close to each other, but it can't articulate everything that we're feeling and thinking. It's a clumsy utility in that way. So we that's why we paint on cave walls. That's why we write books. That's why we go to movies. It's not to learn something new so much. It's to feel something, to engage, to bring something about alive within ourselves that is already there, but that just needs to be awoken. So I think Marvin Gaye's a great one. Jim Morrison is a great one. Stuart Davis, a dear friend of mine, is one of the most brilliant lyricists ever, and he has the theme song actually in Grace and Grit. Nicola, one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard, probably akin to U2's One. I worked with these two musicians, Kim and Catherine Kluge, and they are composers. They did the score for Martin Scorsese's Silence, and they also did the original score for Grace and Grit. And so we developed a very close relationship while we were working on this film together. And they're brilliant musicians. We really made love to trying to, in terms of articulating something on screen that has to be evoked but that can't be said. We're amazing musicians, that I was able to work with.
If you had your bucket list to do something left, or what would it be that you still say, I want to do this, Gary? What would that be?
I would like to have a shot of tequila with a wild turkey chaser and a 151 floater. No, I did a lot of that as a kid. I started early. I started partying when I was like 12. And by the time I was 18, I was done. I want to do another picture. I'm working on a few, and the gestation period is, hard to determine. One's a biblical epic. The challenges that speak to me in that are large. There's a studio picture that I'm examining. And there's another film that I'm looking at that's just brilliant writing that has also an amazing reach. There are challenges, I think, within myself that would be demanding of me because of their discomfort. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that I would like to be required to move to a place like a place where I don't speak the language in a town that doesn't speak English. So let's say a small town in Italy somewhere, or in France somewhere, or a freezing place like the Arctic. But that I need to move there because the calling is so great. A group of individuals or a high calling to achieve something, to do something, to make a movie, and be there for so long that I have to learn another language. That I have to be so hot in the Sahara Desert or so cold in the snow. In other words, I don't want to do that. But I'm tempted by, I hope for that calling, that the thing will be so great that it will transform me, that I'll have to do it, and that I'll have to, in other words, allow the crucifixion for a new resurrection within my own being, in very much the same way that Grace and Grit did for me. It spoke to me. I didn't say, hey, I'm going to go make this movie. It said, man, you got to make this. You're the only guy who can tell this story. I'm the one to tell that story because I've read all Ken Wilber's books and I understand his writing. And I understand what needs to be articulated in that film beyond the simple love story. This is a story, Grace and Grit, about transcendence, and it has to weave the author's voice in there. And I think I'm the right person to tell that story because of it. And I think the film is spectacular, and because of all the partners I've had along the way, on screen and off screen. I hope to be called in the same way, to be challenged in the same way, to do something that I can rise to the occasion in the same way.
How does Sebastian want to be remembered when he leaves this life?
Wow. Do I get to do the William Wallace Braveheart impersonation here? I mean, that's as good as it gets archetypally, right? That Braveheart speech. I can do it, but I'm going to pop the mic if I do it. I do it really well. The willingness to sacrifice for that thing that is greater than us. I don't want to hold on to this life and suffocate it.
Correct.
I want something to speak through me. And in that, to be able to, what's worth the price of the candle? In other words, that I lit the candle in a way that was worth the price of it, right? That, you look around to the people we admire, right? And there are some people that everyone admires. Not while they're alive necessarily, but after the fact. Martin Luther King, great example. When he was alive, he was hated by so many people, adored and hated, right? And when he died, though, everyone just like, wow, what an amazing man. And what is that? Beyond the obvious things. That this man, even in death, right, his telos was so strong that he accomplished something in death that he couldn't even accomplish in life. That the day he died, the next day, the workers all got their raises. All these men and women taking out trash and working got this because his telos was so strong, right? In other words, and I think when I say that we're inspired by that we may not seek to do something like him, but to sacrifice like him, to say, hey, and to intuit it, to say, I may not make this thing completely, but I'm in service to this thing, and this thing is greater than me. I aspire to that as best as I can, right? To be in service to whatever it is that I'm doing, whoever it is that I'm engaging with,
Well, I want to thank you, Sebastian, for coming in today. It was so refreshing to interview you. And we look forward to Grace and Grit, and we'll have you back when the movie premieres very soon. And I thank you for everything you're doing, and just keep up the good work.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I can't wait to come back. And then when I come back, I'm going to want that 151 tequila wild turkey, okay?
All right. Thank you so much for joining me today on Ready, Set, Live. Until next time, I'm Gary Quinn.